all more or less on some level deal with file formats. So I'm going to start off with discussing the major difference between the program we have been working in Illustrator and the program that we are going to be working in Photoshop, and the programs that we are going to be working with for most of the rest of this time. And what you might be thinking of when I was going through the earlier slides is, but I thought part of what we were doing was we were able to make an icon that we could scale up or down. You keep saying we can only make things smaller. I thought we could make things bigger. Well, that's only true in vector editing programs like Illustrator, and that's what makes them so different and so unique as compared to most of the image editing programs that we work in, which are raster. So what the heck is raster and what the heck is vector? So let's go over that. So the reason that I want to expose you to both is that each one has its pluses and its minuses, and each one is appropriate and the best program depending on the type of design you're trying to execute. We are going to be mostly working with photorealism and things that we want to look like photographs, or actually working with photographs in most of the rest of the projects we're working in. So we're going to be working more with raster based, but vector based ones are great for specific things like icons. So again, with knowing the best tool to pull out of your toolbox, you need to know what kinds of images are best done with vector and which ones are best done in pixel based. So Photoshop is pixel based. So what does that mean? That means that literally when you open up a document, it being the computer, creates a grid. So every document that you create, you basically specify what the grid's going to be. And it's like you took a piece of graph paper, and for each square in the graph paper, you have set what color it's going to be, what shade, how light, how bright. Remember all the parts of color we talked about, hue, saturation, and value? You're setting those parameters. And what Photoshop and other pixel-based or raster-based, they're the same thing. What these pixel-based editing programs do is they fill in that whole grid. And the higher the resolution, the more pixels you have in your grid, the finer the details are in your final product. So they're great for photographs. They're great with anything that has a wide range of color values. We tend to get really good photorealism. That's why it's called Photoshop. So it's kind of in the name. So when you're wanting something to look realistic, when you're wanting to work with photography, you're often wanting to work in a program that allows you that much level of specification. Bitmap is another way, saying the same thing. What raster, it's called raster because one of the things you'll see is that if you bring in a vector into something like Photoshop, which you can do, you can bring in an Illustrator file, it's going to convert it into the grid, and it's going to set exactly where all those little dots are going to fall in your big grid. That process is called rasterizing. It's by taking it from the vector and making it into this grid. So that's why it's called a raster based. Again, bitmap, it's again mapping to those particular bits or the particular pixels. So that's where pixel based comes in. All of them refer to the fact that the computer takes the image and breaks it down into very specific sets of pixels or bits with different color and light values attached to each one of them. And that process is called rasterization. So remember that Photoshop is basically a gigantic grid that you set the parameters on. So it has a set resolution and size. So this way, what you're doing is when you say, I want a image that is 1 inch by 1 inch at 300 dpi, it's basically made a little grid that's 300 by 300. And it's set, okay, what are all the values going to be in there so that you can get that really wide range of color. So when you change the size of the image, it has to do a bunch of calculations in order to figure out what values should go in the new grid. Now, as you can imagine, if you took a piece of graph paper and you colored it in for the different values, if I took a picture of it and made it smaller, that'd be fine. Okay, you can kind of easily fill in what that data is supposed to be. If I blew it up, you're suddenly going to start to see the individual squares. Because what the computer has to do is it's going to have to figure out what should go in the missing spots that it has to make up. So it averages things. So things start to look really fuzzy, or you get that weird staircase, stair-step, blocky look to things. So this is why I've been saying that you can scale things down, but you don't want to scale things up. So I've got a visual example here for you. This is a photograph I took, and you can see it's of a flower that's got a really frilly leaf pattern. So there's a lot of detail going on in this kind of the leaves of this yellow flower. So if I go ahead and I look at it at 100%, and you can see the resolution here, the original, I took it with the camera, so the original resolution is 72 pixels per inch. And so this has a width of 3872 pixels. 3,872 pixels. Now Photoshop will let you change the size. So I'm going to go ahead and take it from 3,000, almost 4,000 pixels to make it only 1,000 pixels wide. And as you can see, it's made that 100% image smaller. So it went from having our little ferny leaves there to now they're kind of small. But they still look very crisp and sharp. So okay, that's fine. Now, what happens if I scale it back up to the 3872 I started with? Well, it ditched all the data when I told it to scale it down to 1000. So now it's trying to guess and fill back in those other, it makes it like almost 4 times as big. And see how blurry the ferns are and the flowers are. All that detail is gone. So even though I'm back to my starting point, because the computer already ditched all that data, it can't go back unless I literally edit undo. But if I had saved this and then opened it again, it's not going to go back to have all that data in it anymore. It's gotten rid of it. So that's why you always want to work big, and you can always shrink down later. And again, this is what it looks like when I come out of it. And you can see it looks blurry. Like, this background's supposed to be blurry. That's not supposed to be blurry. It just looks like it's a bit of a crap photo. Whereas that's the original, which you can see how kind of crisp the edges are on those fern leaves when it's at the original size. So this is why it's so important in a pixel-based raster editing system that you don't scale things down and lose all that data. You don't want your images to look like that. You would much rather have your nice, crisp, clean, because I think in photorealism, it's even more obvious when things aren't the way they're supposed to be. Now, the program we were just working in was Illustrator. And that's really good with flat color. Again, you guys were only allowed to use 2 different colors, or very few colors, or things that, again, you have that kind of that look of icons where they don't have depth, they don't look photorealistic, they're trying to make something look almost abstract. And in that case, what it is that each point, each one of those little dots that we worked on and manipulated, each one of those basically stores a calculation. And it's like if you're in algebra class and you're given an equation and you plug in different values for x. You just resolve the equation given your different input. That's fine, because you have all the information. That formula gives the computer everything it needs to redraw it. Unfortunately, when we're in a grid, there isn't any extra information to base the change in scale off of. So it has to make it up if you're making it bigger, whereas it's a little bit easier if you're making it smaller because it's just throwing data away rather than making things up. So that's why, because it's mathematically based, we could scale our icon in Illustrator up or down. You can scale things up or down without losing fidelity, without losing that crispness of the image, because it redraws the image from scratch each time you open it, each time you scale it. So it doesn't have to guess. It just puts in a different number into the variable. So that's fine. But there's downsides to that. If you want something to look photorealistic, it doesn't really work so well. So that's why it was great for using the icons, where we're trying to make things look abstract, make things look like a stripped down version of themselves, but not going to be so great if you actually want to bring in a photograph. So here are two examples. In each case, one of these is going to be better done in either a vector or raster-based program. As you can see, if you're setting lots of type, especially small type, doing it in a vector-based program is terrific. And in fact, that's something where I was saying you can use vectors inside of Photoshop. Photoshop will put text in as a vector until you, again, rasterize it. And in order to do certain effects, you will need to rasterize it. But until you make it into the bitmap, it will work with it as a vector, because it knows that text looks much cleaner if it's a vector, and it isn't until the last step that it will say, okay, I commit this and I'm going to make it into a bitmap. But if you want this lovely photograph of a water lily, not exactly the same thing as a vector now, is it? As you can see, if you wanted to make an icon of a water lily, that's great. But you don't have that very interesting depth of field where it looks blurry in the background and you've got the foreground picture is sharp and in focus. And as you can see, this shows you very clearly how the grid makes up this photorealistic image, and how the computer basically figures out for each value in each square what it should be in order to look, when you're zoomed out, much more like something in real life. Some more examples. Again, you can see it's great for flat color in vector, where you get you don't get this lovely painterly thing that was going on, so you don't see the brush strokes that were involved in this painting, but you get your edges are much more clean and well defined. So you paint in pixels and you draw with vectors is one way to think about it. So you're painting in Photoshop and you were drawing in Illustrator. Some more examples to show you in detail what happens inside, to visually kind of explain what happens and how we form the grid. And again, I think you can see here how it's actually made up of these little squares. But when we view things not at full size, you don't see that stair stepping. You don't see the individual blocks. You see the whole. Whereas this is very clean no matter what size it is, but you don't have the same background and it doesn't look quite as organic. So again, on the left we've got Photoshop, and on the right you have Illustrator, what you were just working in. So for our kind of review, Photoshop is pixel based. It means that when you open that image, when you create your new image, you're going to create a grid in the computer. And every single pixel, so that's your pixels per inch, it's going to be assigned a color value. And it's great for photography or great for anything that has a lot of different color in it. Again, like that painting. Whereas Illustrator was vector-based, so it's mathematical. It's all geometric. And so it's great for having few colors, because just the way that the math is done, you'd have to have a new set of math for every single part of the image, and it just doesn't do that much math. So you have a lot less data that's needed for the same resolution, but it means that it doesn't handle photorealism as well. So it's terrific for logos, for icons, but what's wonderful about it is in those cases you can make them as big or as small as you want, because it's resolution independent. So that's why we made our icons in Illustrator, but we're going to make our posters that are going to be image based and photo based in Photoshop.